Welcome to our tutorial for the week, and this week we're going to be looking at Macbeth Act 3 Scene 4, and this is the scene where we meet Banquo's ghost. So as usual, if you haven't already done so, you need to read through the scene, and everything after this point will assume that you are familiar with it. Okay, so let's recap what happens in this scene. Well, it's the coronation banquet. If you remember in the previous couple of scenes, Macbeth has been telling us about what's going to be happening in the evening, and finally we've reached the actual event itself. And all the lords and ladies have gathered at the castle at Forres to celebrate with Macbeth. Now, Macduff and Banquo are notably not there, and we know why Banquo isn't there. It's because he's dead, but Macduff is continuing to boycott anything to do with Macbeth being crowned king. Now, just as Macbeth is about to sit down at the banqueting table, the murderer arrives. And if you remember, they agreed in the previous scene that they were going to go and tell Macbeth what had happened. So the murderer arrives and he tells Macbeth what has happened, that Banquo is dead, but Fleance has escaped. And just after this, after the murderer leaves, Banquo's ghost appears and he's seated in Macbeth's place at the table, and it's quite significant, so we're going to talk about that in a little while. Macbeth thinks that one of the lords, or perhaps even Lady Macbeth, has played a trick. Lady Macbeth tells him off for behaving so strangely. He starts to behave in a very peculiar way, and she tells him off. And then the ghost disappears and Macbeth pulls himself together again. But then the ghost reappears and Macbeth is absolutely terrified and really loses all sense of other people being present. He is just consumed with terror. And Lady Macbeth pretends that Macbeth is suffering from an illness that he's had to deal with for years, to try and sort of cover over what's going on. But ultimately, she sends the lords and ladies away when it becomes clear that Macbeth can't cope anymore. And Macbeth recognises that what he's experiencing is a direct consequence of the deeds he's committed. So the murder of Duncan and the murders of Banquo and the attempted murder of Fleance. And he says that he believes the worst is still to come, that this is only the beginning of the consequences that he is going to face. And finally, Lady Macbeth tells him to go to bed, and that she assumes that he's troubled because he needs some sleep, and that's where the scene ends. So that's our quick recap. Let's get on with some analysis and see what Shakespeare's up to in this scene. Okay, so the scene begins and the stage direction stayed the same. Now that means that we're in the same place as the previous couple of scenes, but this time we've moved inside the palace. So we're at the palace at Forres, and this is later on in the same day as the previous two scenes. And in come Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, Ross, Lennox, some more lords and their attendants. And this would be quite a grand opening to a scene, and there'd probably be quite a lot of music and fanfares, lots of interesting costumes. And these characters, particularly the random lords and their servants, would often be played by people that had made a financial contribution to the play. So in terms of Shakespeare's theatre, this would be quite a spectacular scene and would be an opportunity for people who couldn't act but love the theatre to have a little on-stage role without having to speak. Now, Macbeth's first words are, "You know your own degrees, sit down." And what he means by that is that the lords would be seated in order of status. So the most important lords would be seated nearest the king and queen, and that in this scene is Ross and Lennox. And then all the other lords would be seated in order of their importance. So that's just a little contextual detail. Shakespeare's playing around here because although Macbeth doesn't mean it ironically, Shakespeare loads these words with meaning, and actually there's lots of references in the rest of the play to performance and playing a role and acting. He says he'll play the humble host. What's suggested here is that this is an act. He's putting it on. His humility and his welcome of the guests are a bit fake. And this builds on this idea that Macbeth isn't really the rightful king. He's just playing the part. We also see that there's some awkwardness between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Remember, we've talked in previous tutorials about their relationship starting to fall apart, and we see that they're sort of jarring with each other here. Macbeth says that Lady Macbeth will move around the room and greet the guests, and she immediately follows it with, "No, you do it on my behalf." It's another sign that their relationship is breaking down. What we've got to ask ourselves straight away at the beginning here is what this reveals. Remember, Lady Macbeth has been consumed with the idea of being queen, and this is the most important event of her life after the coronation. So why isn't she moving around? And I think if we really think about it, the telltale signs are there that not everything is quite right with her. Now, Macbeth is talking to the guests at this point, and this happens just after the first murderer has appeared at the door. And so while he's speaking, he's edging towards the door to go and speak to the murderer, and the stage directions tell us this. And the first thing he says is to point out that the murderer has got blood on his face. Now, we've got to keep in mind all the time that this is going on a stage, and there are lots of other people there. All of the lords have gathered, and Macbeth needs for nothing to look suspicious. And so to have a murderer covered in blood appear is really dodgy, and so Macbeth tries to edge his way out to go and deal with him. The murderer confirms that it's Banquo's blood, and Macbeth uses a play on words to show how he feels about the fact that it's clear that Banquo has died. He says that he'd rather have the bloody murderer standing outside the door of the banquet than have Banquo present in the banquet. And so we're seeing how cold he feels towards Banquo. But nevertheless, he checks. He wants to know for certain that the deed is done. And notice how he uses a euphemism here. Now, that might be a new word. A euphemism is a more polite way of saying something, or a more palatable way of saying something. So again, as we've seen in previous scenes, Macbeth doesn't use the word murder or dead or killed. He says dispatched. Is he put out of the way? He still doesn't seem to feel comfortable using words associated with murder. It's still quite distasteful. And the murderer here doesn't just confirm it, but he adds some detail, and he describes the manner of death in quite a graphic way. Now, this is quite important. He adds more detail later. We'll go into why this is important in a moment. But he tells Macbeth that Banquo's throat is cut, which is a wound that is impossible to recover from. So he confirms Banquo is definitely dead. And this makes Macbeth quite happy, and he congratulates the murderer, and then says that he hopes the same was done to Fleance. Now, if he's cold about Banquo, remember Fleance is a little boy. Look how much more cold he is towards Fleance, because he knows that Fleance is the bigger issue. Fleance is the one he's really got the problem with. And this forces the murderer to tell Macbeth what's happened. Now, notice how he does it. He starts with some flattery, and says, "Most royal sir." He's showing how humble he is, how subservient he is. And then, look, even the word is abbreviated here. He blurts out that Fleance has run away and has escaped, almost like he wants to just get it over with, because he's scared to tell Macbeth, quite rightly, because Macbeth is very unpredictable, and the murderer, more than anyone else, knows how Macbeth deals with his enemies. And the effect on Macbeth is really quite profound. He describes the fear he feels at Fleance's survival as a fit. It's this sudden and overwhelming feeling that he has. And he uses a metaphor to describe what he doesn't have. So he talks about the security that Fleance's death would have brought, and he uses metaphors based around rock and solid things to talk about how totally secure his kingship would be had Fleance been killed. But the contrast is really shocking with the reality of the situation. Now, another thing to notice, there's not a note on this, but look at the vowel sounds in this bit. This is assonance. The vowel sounds in this bit where he's talking about rocks are very open. So we've got whole as the marble, founded as the rock. They're very open vowel sounds. And we've got more broad, casing air. And then he talks about what the reality is, and look at the difference. He talks about being cabined, cribbed, confined. Now we've got alliteration there, that hard C sound in all the words. And it reflects the anguish he feels, as though he's clenching his jaw while he's saying it. Now, as well, look how the vowel sounds have changed. We've got I, o, short vowel sounds compared with those broad vowel sounds previously. So Shakespeare's use of language here shows the contrast between what he could have had and what he currently feels. It's a torment to him that Fleance has survived. And notice the ironic use of the word safe here. He's not really talking about Banquo's safety, because Banquo is dead. He's far from safe. Macbeth is talking about his own safety, that Banquo is done away with so that he can't tell anybody what he knows about Macbeth. Now, the murderer here adds more detail. So we already know Banquo's throat has been cut, but now we're given a little bit more detail. And to reassure Macbeth, he says that Banquo is lying in a ditch with 20 trenched gashes on his head, the least a death to nature. Now, what he means is that Banquo has received 20 blows to the head, only one of which would have made sure he was dead. So it's almost like he's saying Banquo has been killed 20 times over, and then to make sure his throat was cut as well. And this adds to this graphic detail about Banquo, which is really important, as we'll see. Now, there's more irony. Macbeth says, thanks for that. And it's ironic because he's not really that grateful, because he knows that it's all well and good that Banquo is dead, but Banquo wasn't prophesied to be king. It's his children. And actually, Macbeth knows that it would have been better if Fleance had been killed and Banquo survived, because we know from a study of the divine right of kings, I talk about that in previous tutorials, that no one can accuse the king of anything. He can't be tried in a court. So even if Banquo did tell anybody that he believed that Macbeth killed Duncan, Macbeth is now the king, and so nothing can be done about it. But at least the throne would be secure. But it's happened the other way around. Banquo is dead, but the real threat, Fleance, still survives. Banquo has still got an heir that can get that throne. And Macbeth summarises this in a metaphor, and he talks about snakes here. And here, Banquo is the grown serpent, and the worm is Fleance, the baby snake, the worm. And he foretells that whilst Fleance doesn't pose a problem now because he's just a little boy, he will grow up, and his anger will grow and will turn into venom, and he'll grow teeth, and he'll be more dangerous because now he feels the need to avenge his father. And so Macbeth knows that Fleance escaping might not be a problem immediately, but long term is going to really cause problems. It's going to come back to bite him, almost literally. Now, at this point, Lady Macbeth intervenes because everybody's waiting for Macbeth while he's having this chat with the murderer. The murderer goes, and Lady Macbeth sort of gently rebukes him publicly. This is her playing the part of the loving wife. And so she speaks to him in a way that shows him respect and honour, but she is telling him off publicly. So again, this is starting to fall apart a little bit. Now, the other guests wouldn't be allowed to eat until Macbeth was seated and eating with them, and so they're all sitting there waiting while he's having his chat with the murderer. Now, it's really important to notice that the ghost only appears after the murderer has described the manner in which Banquo died, and it's as though that graphic detail has come to life in the form of Banquo's ghost. And perhaps without those details, Macbeth wouldn't have seen the ghost at all. It's only because now he can visualise the state that Banquo has been left in that he sees the ghost. Now, that word perhaps is really important, and we're going to mention it several times, because if you want to access those top grades, one of the things that all the examples look for is your ability to suggest alternative ways to interpret a text. We can never just read this in one way, and so perhaps is a really good word to use to explore alternative interpretations of a text. So we'll mention it quite a lot. So Macbeth clearly hasn't noticed the ghost. So whilst the audience sees the ghost, Macbeth hasn't yet. And strangely, he draws attention to the fact that Banquo isn't present. And he says, this is again him pretending to not know where Banquo is. He says that he'd rather think that it was unkindness that was stopping Banquo being there, rather than misfortune. So he's basically saying, isn't it strange? I hope he's just being mean. I hope nothing bad's happened to him, which is him covering over the fact that he knows exactly why Banquo isn't present. And his words are loaded with dramatic irony because, of course, the audience can see that Banquo is present in the form of the ghost. Ross invites Macbeth to come and sit down and join them, and Macbeth can't see where to sit. He says the table's full. He begins to notice Banquo's ghost, and Lennox points out that they've saved him a seat. Now, this makes it clear to us that the guests can't see the ghost either. So the audience can see the ghost. Macbeth can see the ghost, although he hasn't realised that it's a ghost yet. But the other characters are unaware that there's anybody there. And that's really important. This is another example of the stage directions being hidden in the dialogue of the characters. So Macbeth then notices the ghost and clearly recognises it as Banquo's bloodied form, and he immediately thinks that he's been caught out. He says, which of you has done this? And this reveals to us that his conscience is an issue. He's making here straight away the link between his actions and being found out, the consequences of them. And look at what he says. He says, thou canst not say I did it. Never shake thy gory locks at me. Now, the gory locks part shows us that the details that the murderer gave Macbeth have taken form in this ghost. And so what he's referring to is all the blood in the hair of Banquo because of the blows to his head. Now, the questions that are asked by the other guests again show how incredulous they are. They don't understand what he's talking about. And this is a dramatic device to make it clear that Macbeth is the only one at that table that can see the ghost. Ross and Lennox are trying to cover over for the king. So this is Lennox here. My face is just covering the character name. So Lennox doesn't know what Macbeth's talking about, and Ross actually tries to end the banquet and assumes that Macbeth is ill. So when he says gentlemen rise, he's basically saying let's go, Macbeth's poorly. The reason he's saying this is that he's probably the next ranking guest after Macbeth. So he's trying to protect Macbeth from embarrassment and get everybody to go, because he's the one that's got to take control if the king is incapacitated. But Lady Macbeth comes to the fore here because she is not going to have her evening ruined. So she gets the idea from Ross that Macbeth might be unwell, pounces on that idea and develops it, and she tells everybody to sit back down. So while Ross is telling everyone to go, she's not going to have the banquet ruined, tells them all to sit back down. And she says that he's often like this. Publicly, she's covering for Macbeth, saying it'll be over in a minute, it happens all the time, don't worry about it. And then right at the end, this question here, I think she mutters to Macbeth, and she falls back on her old favourite persuasion technique, and she insults his masculinity. Publicly, she's all sweetness and light. Privately, she rebukes him and insults him. Now, Macbeth is forced again to defend his bravery and his masculinity, and he says that because he's looking at the ghost, that proves that he is totally a man. And it seems that he's unaware that no one else can see what he's looking at. And Lady Macbeth responds with real anger, and she clearly knows about his previous hallucination of the dagger, because she brings it up, and she dismisses what Macbeth is seeing as something similar to that. And she says it's the air-drawn dagger. It's the very painting of your fear. It's just your imagination. And look at the way her language shows how unconvinced she is. She says, you said the dagger led you to Duncan. She says that his actions are imposters to true fear. It's like pretend fear. It's not believable. And then she describes it as a story, so suggesting he's making it all up. Also, she links it to the behaviour of a silly woman telling ghost stories to her grandmother in front of a fire in the winter. So again, she's saying you're behaving like a girl. And finally, she sarcastically dismisses his fear, and she doesn't understand him. And remember, in previous scenes, she's been able to work with him to convince him, to bring him round to her way of thinking. Here, she doesn't even try. She just mocks him and says, when all's said and done, you're scared of a chair. And she just throws away his quite genuine fear and shows no compassion whatsoever. Now, these visions foreshadow what's going to happen to Lady Macbeth, because in a few scenes' time, we're going to see her having her own version of hallucinations and visions. Perhaps it's her lack of sympathy here and her unwillingness to admit that she also is troubled by what they've both done that seals her fate. Look at the way Macbeth's language reveals his state of mind. It's really staccato, it's abrupt, just a series of exclamations rather than full sentences. And he's pleading with her. This word prithee means please, please. It's a desperate please. He wants her to see what he's seeing. He's desperate for her to still be in this with him. His language shows how alarmed and frightened he is, and he's asking questions here, probably of the ghost rather than of Lady Macbeth. Here he's talking to the ghost, and this tells us what the person playing Banquo's ghost would need to be doing. So it seems that Banquo's ghost is pointing at Macbeth and nodding as if to say, I know it was you. And so those stage directions are in Macbeth's dialogue. Now, this all seems quite serious, but I have seen this scene played for laughs, and there's a lot of evidence here that this could be used as almost a bit more comic relief before the very dark journey towards the ending of the play. And so it's possible, perhaps, this is supposed to be funny. Macbeth then says, if charnel houses and our graves must send those that we bury back, our monument shall be the moors of kites. And what he means is, if tombs aren't a safe place to put dead bodies anymore, we need to chop them into bits and feed them to the birds rather than bury them whole, because if we chop them into bits, they can't come back to haunt us. Now, that can be interpreted as a funny line, or it's quite horrific, the idea of properly disposing of bodies in that really gruesome way. You can interpret it either way. Macbeth says something here again that could be interpreted as a joke. He says, in the past, when you bash somebody's brains out, they stayed dead, but now this man has come back to haunt us. And so that could be delivered in quite a comic way. Alternatively, this could show us the beginning of Macbeth knowing that justice is going to be served and he's going to pay for his crimes, that things are going to come back to reveal what he's been up to. It's also another quite gruesome description. So this is Macbeth consumed with the ideas of blood and gore. It comes out in his language. So there's lots of ways to interpret that. Could be funny, could be him realising that there's no escape from justice. It could be just him being gruesome and graphic because he's so familiar with death and blood and gore. Now, we mentioned at the beginning that Banquo taking Macbeth's seat was significant, and the reason for this is that, if you remember the witch's prophecy, Banquo's heirs ultimately will be on the throne, and so Banquo is sitting in the seat reserved for the king, and this is symbolic of the fact that his heirs are going to dethrone Macbeth. They're going to literally push him off the throne and take his place. And if you remember, this was one of Macbeth's biggest fears. He talks about Banquo's character being far more kingly, and here it's once again his fears becoming real, that he fears being found out, but he also fears Banquo's heirs taking his place. And so the form of the ghost is really the embodiment of all of Macbeth's deepest fears. Lady Macbeth repeats the idea of his lack of manliness. Now, I want you to think about how we've seen her behave and speak before, because back in Act 1, she was so clever and she tried lots of different approaches to get Macbeth to do what she wanted. But here, she seems like a bit of a one-trick pony. She just keeps repeating the same thing over and over again. And while she might seem abrasive and harsh and cold, we've got to wonder where that cleverness has gone. Where has her persuasive skill disappeared to? Because she doesn't seem able to do it anymore. And so we've got, again, some glimmers that she's not quite well. She's not quite herself. Now, again, Lady Macbeth presents well publicly, calling him my worthy lord. Remember, she's just called him womanly and insulted his masculinity privately in the previous lines. So we've got another example of her being duplicitous here, where she's pretending to be all nice and honourable, honouring of her husband, when actually she's being horrible to him. After Banquo's ghost disappears, Macbeth again seems to become completely in his right mind again. And this is another thing that could be played in quite a funny way. So while the ghost is there, Macbeth loses the plot. And when the ghost goes, he's totally back to normal again. And he plays along with this idea of him being ill. He says, this is nothing. If you know me, you know I'm like this. And everybody ignores it. And he tries to be light-hearted. but it's unconvincing and really sort of jarring. Think about the dramatic impact of this. How would you feel if you were a lord at this coronation banquet? This is your new king screaming about a ghost that he can see that nobody else can. It wouldn't fill you with confidence that this was a worthy ruler of the nation. I wonder whether he would ever be able to win back the support of the lords. Now, it seems like everything's fine, but then the ghost of Banquo comes back in, and Macbeth immediately has another turn. So any good that he possibly did in that previous speech is completely unravelled, because he becomes completely incomprehensible. So he's basically trying to convince himself that this ghost is in his imagination, and so there's nothing to fear. So you could argue that he's actually talking to himself there rather than to the ghost. Now, remember that the audience can see the ghost, all the other characters can't. And so you've got to think about how this would be performed on stage. And there's lots and lots of ways of making the ghost appear and disappear, and having Macbeth behave in very peculiar ways. So it's worth thinking about how you would direct this, because one of the things you're going to need to show in your exam is an awareness that this is a play that would be acted on a stage. So anything that you can do to show you've thought about that is really helpful. Now again, Lady Macbeth desperately tries to recover the situation. She's still holding out hope that she will have her banquet. It seems that she is more concerned about the evening being spoiled than she is about the state that her husband is in. Macbeth is sobbing on the floor, and she just talks about how it's spoiling the banquet. And so again, think about how you would respond if you were one of the guests. Certainly you would think that something was not quite right in their relationship. Now, what Macbeth says here shows that he fears what Banquo represents more than any other horror. He talks about all the things he'd prefer to have present, and he wishes that Banquo could be alive again, and he wishes he could fight it out man to man. And so there's a sense here that Macbeth regrets the course of action that he's taken. He regrets sending murderers to ambush Banquo. He wishes he'd done it in an honourable way. Now, this is the first glimpse of Macbeth wishing he could go back to the way it was at the beginning of the play, because what he's talking about here is the way that a soldier would deal with things. He makes it clear that the way soldiers behave, there's honour in that. So even though he's king, it seems that Macbeth feels that the way he became king really matters, and he can't get any contentment from being king because of how he achieved it. And so this is a theme that's going to play out through the rest of the play, that Macbeth wants to turn back the clock and go back to being an honourable soldier rather than a dishonourable king. And again, we've said already, but he becomes increasingly distressed and nonsensical. It's just blurting out just expressions of alarm and fear. Sentences don't even make sense. And again, the ghost of Banquo goes, and he's back to normal. And look how incongruous this is. That word means like out of place, doesn't fit. Banquo's ghost vanishes, and he goes, oh, he's gone. Oh, I'm fine again now. As though that wipes out everything that's gone before. It just makes Macbeth's behaviour even more peculiar. And again, we've got action on the stage being revealed through the dialogue. So Macbeth tells everybody to sit still, and that tells us that all the lords have started to get up to leave because they just can't bear this anymore. And Lady Macbeth intervenes here, and she blames the situation entirely on him. Look at her. You have displaced the mirth. So you could argue whether she says this privately or publicly, but certainly she lays all the blame for this at Macbeth's feet. And notice her irony here. We've got almost like an oxymoron here, admired disorder. She's saying that he's behaved so strangely that it's almost impressive just how badly he's made the evening go. But she's being ironic. She doesn't admire it at all. Now, Macbeth's words here are really the turning point, because this is where Lady Macbeth has to intervene, because it's almost like Macbeth is about to say all that they've done. He's about to confess, it would seem. He says to Lady Macbeth, "You make me strange." That means that she makes him doubt himself. And the reason for that is that he can't understand how she can see horrific sights and still keep the colour in her cheeks, because he is like white as a sheet. He's terrified and he can't understand. Now, what's significant about this is that it's clear that she couldn't see the ghost. So what horrors is he talking about? He's not talking about the ghost. What he's talking about is the bloody body of Duncan at the point at which he was murdered. And this is a step too far. What we do see here, though, is that they are so far apart. He's basically admitting that he doesn't understand her anymore. He cannot fathom why he, a soldier, is in such a state, and she, a woman, is seemingly fine. Now, we know that she isn't fine, and we're going to see what's happening with her in a few scenes' time. But he just cannot get his head around it, and it makes him doubt everything about himself. Now, Ross asks what sights he's talking about. Macbeth seems to have forgotten that there were others present, and so Ross asks what he means. Now, he means Duncan's body, and Lady Macbeth realises this and dives in immediately and sends everybody away. She says, "Don't talk to Macbeth. If you talk to him, it makes him worse. Go." And she tells them not to leave in a polite way in order of importance, but just get out. And so off they all go. And Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are left alone on stage, and they both seem really quite broken at this point. Now, I've highlighted this line in bright green because it's one worth learning off by heart. It's a really important line, because Macbeth is reflecting. He's reflecting on what's just happened and what it all means. And he's concluded that he is never going to escape justice. Justice is going to be served at some point. He can't escape. He's basically saying that because he's murdered, murder will come his way, and he's almost predicting his own downfall at the end. He's saying that because he's murdered, he himself will be killed at the end. And he says that the whole of nature, the whole of creation, is going to conspire against him to bring the truth to light. So he's talking about ravens and rooks and crows digging up dead bodies, and gravestones moving, and trees even speaking to bring the truth to light. And this is all linked to that great chain of being. Because Macbeth broke the chain, nature is in chaos and will make it absolutely clear that he is not a legitimate king. Now, he asks what time it is, whether it's morning yet, and Lady Macbeth says that she can no longer tell the difference between day and night. And this is another one of those things where opposites have been merged together and the lines blurred. And this goes right back to the beginning of the play, that prediction, fair is foul and foul is fair. Here it's day is night and night is day. Now, Macbeth brings up Macduff and notices that Macduff isn't there. And he does this because he wants to draw our attention, first of all, to the fact that Macduff isn't there. But Macduff is going to take a really significant part in the remainder of the play. And so Shakespeare's using this scene to reintroduce all of the themes and characters that are going to be important for the resolution of this story. So we've had the theme of consequences, we've had the theme of justice, we've had the theme of blood, and we've now got the character of Macduff being brought back to the fore by Macbeth. Macduff is going to be the one to fix it because he is the next highest ranking Thane. So after the king, it's Macduff, and so it's Macduff's duty to put it right, which is why he's going to do it. Now, Macbeth reveals, Lady Macbeth suggests that the reason Macduff wasn't there is because Macbeth forgot to invite him. So again, she's thinking the worst of her husband, but Macbeth reveals here the tone of the way he's ruling, and he says that he has put a spy in every household in Scotland, in the houses of every Thane. So he knows that Macduff got the invite because there's a spy in the house. And so this is introducing his reign of terror for the rest of the play. So this is Macbeth dealing in secrecy and sort of intrigue and subterfuge. He's got spies everywhere. So this is Macbeth ruling by fear. Now, he also introduces another set of characters that we might have forgotten about, and that's the witches. So he reminds us of the witches, and he resolves to go and see them the next day. And the reason he wants to go is that he needs to know how this is all going to end. So even if it's terrible, he needs to know how it's all going to end. And so that introduces them because they're going to be in the next scene, and we're going to need to be aware of them for the remainder of the play. And then he uses this metaphor again, and the metaphor is again of blood. So we've got this theme of blood coming back to the front. And the image here is like a swimmer swimming a long distance, getting halfway and realising it's just as hard to go back as it is to carry on. And so he's resigned to this really dark path that he's on, because continuing to kill and murder is no more difficult for him now than trying to put things right. He's so accustomed and familiar with murder that he might as well just carry on. And this foreshadows what's to come in the next few scenes, because there's going to be a lot more death and murder, and it sort of implies the way he's going. And he also says here that he's got strange things in his head that must be acted before they're thought about. So that implies to us that he's got plans that he's not yet ready to talk about until after they're done. So that tells us that he's about to commit some more horrible deeds. Now, as we've said, Shakespeare is making the transition here between what's gone before and what's to come in the play. This is a really important transitional scene where the scales, the balance tips against Macbeth. So all of these themes and ideas have been reintroduced. Now, look at his language here, because as he's coming back into calm, his language comes back into being sort of that higher quality, and so iambic pentameter gradually returns and the rhyme scheme gradually regulates. So it starts being not present at all, then it's a bit irregular, and then by the end of the speech he's speaking in rhyming couplets. Now that shows his state of mind, but it also draws our attention to these lines as they close the scene, because they're really important lines pointing towards the next part of the play. Now, Lady Macbeth doesn't engage with what he's just said at all. She doesn't even notice that he's implied he's going to kill more people. And she just says, oh, you just need some sleep, that's all. And again, this emphasises their separateness. She thinks he just needs some sleep. There's no engagement with his trauma, with his distress, with the fact that he's going to go to the witches again. She's totally detached, really defeated. and unaware of the significance of his words. She seems just resigned to it all, and it's worth noting that this is the last time we see Lady Macbeth and Macbeth together. We don't see them together again for the rest of the play. This is it for them. And the next time we see Lady Macbeth, she is completely broken, sleepwalking, in a terrible state. And so that's it for them both. Really, the end is determined at this point. And Macbeth closes out the scene by foreshadowing the ending. He says, "We are yet but young indeed." And so he's suggesting that even though they've come all this way, it's only the beginning of the trouble that they're going to face. And that's the end of the scene. So what's important, really quickly? First of all, it's important that Macbeth has a conscience, and it's very active. He feels very guilty about what he has done. He's tormented by his actions. It's almost like he's in hell already. He's being tormented and tortured by the memories of what he's done. And he makes the connection for us between his actions and his experiences. So he knows that seeing the ghost, seeing the dagger are consequences of what he's done. It's also important that his mental ill health is completely out in the open now. Everyone's seen it, so he can't keep his instability private anymore. And possibly most importantly, the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth is completely broken by the end of the scene. They are totally separate. And Shakespeare dramatically has set up the last two acts of the play in this scene. So that's it for our walkthrough. I hope that's been helpful. The response task this week is to complete the scene frame for Act 3, Scene 4, and it's here, it's on the last slide. If you are linked to me on Frog, I will email it to you, I'll send it to you. But this is the scene frame. This is just you pulling together all of the things that we've discussed in this tutorial into one place, so you've got it there ready for revision. So I hope that's been helpful, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Bye.